Welcome back to the show. We are joined by Sean and Pauline. Sean, and Pauline, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah,
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us.
Why don't we take a few minutes just to introduce who you are and what you do, and we'll jump into AWS Deadline Cloud. Sean, why don't you go first?
Great. My name is Sean Wallish. I am a Senior Specialist Solutions Architect here at AWS. I'm on a team called the Visual Compute Team, and our team just helps customers who make things like pretty pixels in the cloud just achieve those goals, and we help them with best practices and solutions and the architecture they make and all the other fun stuff. And I've been here for about 2.5 years. Before that, I was a visual effects artist for a decade before I discovered that I liked building tools for my fellow visual effects artists. So I took a career change, turned into a programmer where I worked at places like DreamWorks Animation, did that for a little while, and then came to AWS, where I started working with Pauline.
That's me. Hi. So I started off as a barista slinging coffee in Sydney. That's where I'm from. But these days I've kind of lost the accent. For a large chunk of sort of my past, I've been working in visual effects, film and feature animation, that sort of thing on the vendor side of things. So at studios, kind of all over the place. I've had the lucky chance to work in Sydney as well as in London, and then here as well. I also did a brief stint with some cloud gaming services as well. And I'm a product manager now on AWS Deadline Cloud, and also a little project called Open Job Description.
Very cool. Well, welcome to the show. It looks like we've got some folks tuning in from Asia and Europe. We just had someone comment they're coming in from Texas. So you've got a global audience here to talk about AWS Deadline Cloud. And so I'm going to cue it up with like the first question. What is AWS Deadline Cloud?
AWS Deadline Cloud is a managed service on AWS that helps creative teams get rendering faster than ever before. AWS Deadline Cloud comes from the team behind ThinkBox Deadline, which was a product that was made over 20 years ago and was designed for on-prem static size render farms. And over time, it has evolved to do things like hook into AWS and become more elastic. But at its heart, it was still not a managed service. It still had its rough edges around it. And so Pauline and her team, and they're going to talk about it in just a little bit, took a look at everything that Deadline 10 did and what they could do from the ground up to make a managed service on AWS, which would allow people to render visual effects and animation and architectural visualization easier than ever before. Pauline, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say that it's one of those things where everybody likes to orchestrate their compute a little bit differently. And compute orchestration inside this sort of segment is really particularly called render farms or render farming. So if you hear farms or render farms, just know that it's kind of our little term for deployments of machines, sort of clusters of machines, high performance computers usually. So I've used products like these for a long time before I was ever a product manager on this, and that's where we're coming from.
I think you took the question right out of my mouth. I was going to say, what's a render farm? Like what we're talking about, not the farming I'm talking about in the intro here.
It has nothing to do with chickens.
What? I was
unless you're working on a movie with animated chickens or realistic chickens of any kind. I have worked on many movies with furry animals, and so I have worked on movies with chickens before.
So we can render chickens, but we're not collecting eggs at the end of it.
We can absolutely render chickens. We can render chickens on AWS Deadline Cloud.
So Sean, I want to touch on something you mentioned. It's a term that we say a lot, and I think it's one of those terms that we tend to, if we're an Amazonian, you gloss over. You said managed service. This is a managed service. What does that mean to have a managed service, and how is that different than what customers might be used to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in an on-prem render farm, or you basically have a big data center, right? And when you have a data center on-prem, you're responsible for everything about that data center, right? You're responsible for the electricity, the management of the data center, installing racks, installing hardware into that, the hardware upgrade cycle, all that fun stuff. When you move to AWS, you stop having to manage the data center, but you still have to manage a lot of that infrastructure on AWS. So you have instances still, you might have senior systems, you're still how your networking is set up, how your machine images look, what your software you're going to put on them, security patches, upgrades, all that stuff that some people I tend to quite like sometimes, and other parts of it I tend to not like. A managed service on AWS takes a lot of that day-to-day management, like security patches, and handles it for you. So another managed service on AWS would be the Document DB managed service, which I quite like because I quite detest working with databases. AWS Deadline Cloud is another managed service on AWS, which also manages the database for you, so you don't have to. And basically, instead of the traditional way of doing a render farm or burst elastic rendering on AWS, you will no longer have to manage your workers' machine images or how they're networked or how they're connecting to various things, or fret about like what performance storage to attach to this render machine to get the best performance out of it. All that stuff is handled for you behind the scenes by AWS. And so you can focus on the differentiating factors for your business, like how you're going to organize these visual effects shots into sequences, what artists you're going to assign to what security permissions you give to them, etc.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I think it's something that's really powerful about using the cloud, right? You don't have to manage all of these computers and figure out how they're networked, keep them on, what happens when they go down in the middle of the night. So all of that stuff, sort of that burden is lifted off you, and you just get to work on whatever it is you're working on and focus in on that. And today we're going to be doing that for a rendering farm. Adrian, do you have any questions for our guests here? I don't want to hog all the spotlight.
No, you're fine. And you touched on a point that I was going to make about the value that undifferentiated heavy lifting and using a managed service. A couple of years ago, I did some research for a group of consulting partners on what is the value of actually leveraging the managed service versus do it yourself. Roll up your sleeves. I'm an old data center guy, got plenty of bumps and bruises and broken things on me as a result. And was able to put a dollar to a number, or something along the lines of like $1.4 million per individual task per shift hour that ends up getting wasted. So if you can just even think reinvesting that back into the business, that's huge. But we're here to talk about the render farm. So I know from my own experience in trying to do really bad visual design and a couple failed attempts at CAD in college, what's typically so necessary? What's that driving factor that requires faster render to be able to set the farm up, get that capacity, and just get off and going? Is it one of those things where the faster you go, something happens, or is it just one of those you want to be cautiously optimistic and try to plan as you go on?
Yeah. Wow. That's a big one. I love this. Let me pull this apart a little bit for you and bring us all along the journey. I think so. The main thing is generally the purpose of like trying to render something not on your local machine is it gets slow, right? And so if there's a lot of resources being used to do the sort of high performance visual computing needed to turn 3D into pretty pixels, sometimes it's a struggle to do anything else on the machine. So the first key purpose is just get that workload onto somebody else's machine. And so you can keep going on constructing new versions of that scene, right? So you might pop in a different rooster than the first rooster that you had in there, and then just get another variant, for example. So now write that out to a larger scale. So it's not just you, but you're part of a team of anywhere between 5 to 25 folks to sometimes, hundreds, depending on sort of the style. And when you're doing that, sometimes it becomes a big choice of, do we buy those machines? Do we pay for them now or later? Will we have the business for the rest of the year? Or is this just for one sports events commercial sort of project, right? And so some of those decisions become really difficult. And that's where sort of the elasticity comes in of a managed service too. And that's where we're trying to sort of extend the boundaries of, I think a lot of people are very proficient now at running the workloads somewhere else. And now it's about letting them do that in a way that's easier to understand, and without them having to fiddle with the fundamental bits and pieces. Now, unlike Sean, I do like playing around at the configuration settings for like local resources and hooking things up. So I have less of an issue with that part of things. But
hold on, I like most infrastructure setup. It's just databases.
Yeah.
But Pauline, so I heard you say something that's really important. So rendering is a computationally expensive thing to do, and when you're doing that, it's hard to do it on a local machine. And then if you want to do that and on-prem, it's really expensive. It can be hard to coordinate and then have multiple teams. And then you said something else that was very interesting. I didn't realize this, but rendering studios who are using this to render effects are doing different variants all the time and testing different scenes and how they might do, or different markets might have something tweaked. And you want to be able to do all that at once really quickly. And AWS, what I heard was AWS Deadline Cloud helps you do that.
That's right. So I think a key thing to think about is that, like a lot of folks in the creative industry, the people who are producing visual effects or feature animation, really anything that's of a very high visual quality, they think about it as a creative process, and art is never finished. It's just kind of abandoned and submitted back to the client when they're happy with it. And so sometimes you want to address a lot of notes, right? Like, ooh, that light's maybe not the right color, or we want a different species of rooster in this, or something like that. And it's like always these notes, you get multiple of them in multiple review rounds every day. And so you got to address those.
And always against a deadline too. So when your deadline is static and you're running up against that deadline, you still have a certain amount of iterations to do, a certain amount of compute that you have to get through. And so that's where the ability to add elastic compute, like with AWS Deadline Cloud, gets us, because you can expand to utilize compute resources on AWS to increase the amount of work that you can get done in a limited amount of time.
Nice. Well, I'm pumped. I understand you have a demo. I'm like eager to see this. I think we've now that we've talked a little bit about what it is, I'm kind of jacked to see how does it work.
Yeah, me too. The idea of just randomly throwing in a foghorn leghorn and just one individual cell, one render, and just clack it back out.
I don't quite have that ready to go, but we can get a render through and we can set up a farm. So right here, what we're looking at is this is the default AWS console page. I have visited AWS Deadline Cloud before, so it's popping up here on top of us. If we wanted to just go to AWS Deadline Cloud, having never gone there before, it's just a simple matter of typing in here at the top. We want to keep going back to it, which I know you do. You want to hit the star button right there, so it adds it to your favorites bar at the top. Going to click on that. And then one of the things that's important to a lot of the people that we talk to is they wanted the ability to do this type of elastic bursting for new visual effects capacity. And they wanted to do that quickly. And the way that you used to be able to set up an infrastructure, it would take you a while because you were responsible for setting up all the software, all the databases, all the networking, everything you had to do. And with AWS Deadline Cloud, we have a really nice and slick and very impressive, I want to give compliments to the team behind this stuff and the engineers behind this stuff. But basically, it's a real quick setup. The hardest part of this is thinking of a monitor name. And I think our monitor name is going to be Hello Twitch Chat. And we're going to go ahead and do that. And that's going to give us a URL that we can log into later. This was a fresh AWS account with one exception. I set up IAM Identity Center beforehand and just threw in a bunch of users and groups to it. And so Deadline Cloud is going to detect that. It's going to automatically hook up to that identity center, and it's going to start creating some roles for us. These roles in an S3 bucket are pretty much the only things that exist essentially in your account.
Okay.
Clicking on next. It allows you to name your farm individually. Again, I've gotten caught up in this. I've spent like a lot of time finessing the farm details, and I'm going to spare everyone from that. Down here, it allows you to specify users and groups and give them permissions on the farm.
Okay.
And I'm going to give the IT admins owner permission across the entire farm. That means they can see all the various farm details. They can see all the fleets. They can see all the queues, which are groupings of work that you put on the farm. And I could give artists contributor access to the entire farm, but I'm not going to. And the reason why is this: when you give artists contributor access to the entire farm, what happens is that they can see the entire farm and contribute to the entire farm. And that means every single queue. And instead, what we're actually going to show off later is what happens when you actually assign individual groups to individual queues, letting those artists contribute to that grouping of work, but not have access to or see other groupings of work. And then we have a bunch of other settings like customized encryption and adding tags and stuff like that I'm just going to skip past. Queues or groupings of work. A farm can have multiple queues. So if you were working on a TV show, you could have a queue for episode 1, a queue for episode 2, a queue for episode 3, and so forth. Job attachments is a system for getting the dependencies and the files that are required for rendering into the system. And this is an S3 bucket in your account. We're just going to accept the default right there. And then it's going to give us a whole bunch of additional queue settings that we don't need right now, because we're just going to go with a basic, simple setup. And I'm just going to skip past these things, but it's stuff about customer managed fleets with our different type of more infrastructure heavy fleet, budgets, service roles, a Conda queue environment, which will promise I will go over later if we have time. And then finally, you can define a fleet detail. A fleet is literally the machines that you're going to use for rendering. So we haven't obfuscated everything about rendering. It's a managed service, but you still are in control over how you want that render to happen. Whether you want it to happen on 10 machines at a time maximum or 1,000 machines at a time maximum. That's all within your control right there. And you can also control the vCPUs that you're going to get and the RAM that you're going to get right there. Right now, we're just going to leave these things at default, and you can edit them later. It's really important to edit these things later because the default capabilities right here are quite conservative. Then we're creating roles for that fleet. Roles are constructs within AWS that give other constructs permissions to do various things. And that's where I'm going to leave that for now. Finally, the last page, it allows you to review everything you did. I know that I did a perfect job, so I'm just going to scroll down to the bottom and hit create farm right here. And it's going to set up and create that. Now, this process takes about 2 minutes, less really. However, because this is going to create a very simple farm with a simple default queue and a simple default fleet, as soon as this hits 100% and you know that we're not hiding anything, I'm actually going to kick it to Pauline, who has a much more complicated farm setup ready to go and ready to demo. We're just going to wait for this to hit 100%, just so that you know it actually sets up in the time allowed. There we go. So I can go to the dashboard now, and we can look at some various things. As you can see, farms of the resources. We have our Hello Twitch farm. It has a single grouping of work in a queue, has a single fleet in there. You can do access management to add things to the farm. If we go to the queue, you can do access management there, but I'm not going to because Pauline's going to take that.
Very cool. Thank you.
Impressive. Like just a couple of minutes, right? You just configured a whole rendering server farm in just a few minutes. And like Sean, how would compare that to how would that have gone before this type of service? So like what's the time estimate? Like months? Did we just go from months to minutes here?
Our essentially proof of concepts and production jobs when we set up Deadline 10 are existing software. So that's what I'm talking about. Our existing software, which is a much more like installation. You control everything. Those proof of concepts, to get production renders out of them, you're usually talking about a time frame in weeks to months to set up all that stuff, configure it correctly, and get everything down.
Wow. So and that's just POC. You say you're just talking proof of concept.
I'm just talking, proof of concept to getting your first like kind of production renders back from the system and knowing that you're good to go.
That's really cool. And so, Pauline, you're going to take it from here. Do we have your screen shared?
Not just yet, but here we go. Yeah, so the primary reason why we're looking at sort of a pre-configured farm is to get from sort of the little sandbox style deployment to this level of complexity. You're clicking around for at least another 20 minutes or so. And so we just kind of wanted to save everybody time here. So compared to the previous farm that Sean just set up, a key thing to note is that this is the same type of farm. We didn't do anything different. We just added. And so this is all about these resources growing with you to a level of complexity that you may need, because honestly, every one of these creative projects looks a little bit different sometimes, because sometimes people just want to be a little bit different sometimes. So we wanted to allow for that. And as you can see here, we've got quite a few more queues here. So quite a few more projects that we're working on. However, we've kept it to one single fleet. And so just one fleet is sending workers to all of these different jobs in the queues here. Now, what Sean mentioned before is for access management. Oh, let me go ahead and click one of these. Under access management, I can see that individually we have sets of groups that are associated with these projects. So remember when Sean was saying that he didn't want to give the users directly to the whole farm? That's because now he's able to partition the right artists working on the right project, so they don't get confused and submit things to the different queues they're not supposed to use, for example.
So there's a more granular level of access control that you can do within Deadline Cloud.
Exactly.
Very cool.
Exactly. Yeah. We wanted to stay away from anything that was kind of like one size fits none. So it's sort of like you can kind of get really granular, really specific about all of this.
Cool.
Yeah, so let me just show that off too, because I think these have a little bit of different users in these two particular groups that are assigned to this queue. And then let me just go back to the list of queues. You can see that there's definitely more than two. Sean can only see two of them. So I've actually logged in as Sean using my sort of IT admin powers. And right now, Sean's account can actually only see two of the, was it 5 or 6? 5 queues out there. So that just demonstrates that like the interface also changes to sort of the level of detail that you kind of need or have access to.
Okay, so Pauline, you jumped from the AWS console. We were looking at the AWS console where the farm is configured, and you just went to now we're looking at the front end application that actually gets provisioned when you spin up a farm.
Yeah, so let me explain this interface a little bit. This interface is called the Deadline Cloud Monitor. Within the Deadline Cloud Monitor, you can actually monitor your jobs by going a little bit into the queue. Now, I'm not going to dwell here because there's more in the demo, so I'm going to pull back a little bit and just stay here. But fundamentally, this allows folks to not have to log into AWS console to just take a look at their jobs. And this is accessible through a web browser. And we also have a local application for the workstations too that helps you log in via things like SSO.
This is where that access management comes into play. So if I was an artist and I was logging in, I'd only see the queues that I've been assigned access to.
You got it. Exactly
cool.
Right.
Cool. Okay. So we're looking at a queue. What are some of the? Go ahead, Adrian. Sorry, I cut you off.
Oh no. This is pretty awesome. We in the SA world, EA delivery, etc., security especially, we like to talk and preach about RBAC, role-based access control, and this is seemingly RBAC to the nth degree, where we're going to go extremely hyper-specific on what you can and can't do, and it's not for lack of trust in the individual or group individuals, it's to make sure that everybody's only doing the thing and can only either make a whoopsie or work on the actual specific thing they have, that whatever hyper-specified level of permissions. This is pretty impressive. I don't think I've ever seen something like that before.
Oh, thank you.
So now that we've got a sense of the farm is configured, it's set up. Pauline, looks like you've configured some more in-depth queues, and then gave us a brief look at the front-end user face. So, Sean, I understand you're going to kind of take over and show us a little bit deeper what the Deadline Cloud can do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a artist console right here, and I'm going to go ahead and open Blender, which is an open source artist application from the Blender Foundation, which is very popular and a lot of people use it now. And I'm going to go ahead and open a sample project. One of the other great things about Blender is that it actually has a lot of sample projects available on the Blender website. This one is by Andre Razahongo. Very sure I butchered that. However, the name is right here. And they just created this really nice, simple grease pencil demonstration. And because it's nice and because it's fast, this is what we're going to use to kick off to AWS Deadline Cloud so that we have a hope of actually seeing it in the time that we have allotted. To submit this render, which is all done and ready to go to Deadline Cloud, we're going to go up here to the render menu in Blender and just click on Submit to Deadline Cloud. My workstation is already authenticated with Deadline Cloud using that desktop app that Pauline referenced earlier. And so I'm actually ready to hit the submit button down here, but I figured I'd give you a quick view of what we're seeing right here.
Okay, this is a plugin that you install into Blender that will connect your local Blender to your Deadline Cloud instance.
Absolutely, and allows you to submit from within the application.
Right,
we have a couple of these available for popular software products.
Yeah, talk about bringing the mountain to the user. No real disruption to what they're doing and how they're consuming Blender. Is just a minimal size plugin. That's pretty slick.
Yeah, one of the things that we focused on with Deadline Cloud was also the ease of developing these plugins and also the ease of submitting jobs to Deadline Cloud without these plugins in the first place. So there's actually a whole GUI submitter that you can launch as an independent application. And there's a whole specification for how these jobs are structured that is open source, available online on our GitHub. And you can open this application, open a simple YAML file that describes the job and submit it even if we don't have a pre-made built-in submitter for your application.
Cool. We got a really good question from the chat. If we can bring that up, I believe it's the one asking explicitly about queues. Is there any ability to segment within the queues as those jobs and permissions are being defined?
So the queues are the primary permissions grouping there. You're assigning an artist to the queue itself. And so we would tell you to structure your permissions needs around that queue. And we've seen even individual artists assigned to individual queues because the relationship between the queues and the fleets, which are the groupings of workers to do the job, is a many-to-many. So for instance, you could have 50 queues, one for each individual artist, and you could actually have one fleet attached to all 50 queues. And so the queues just become a grouping mechanism. And then you have the same fleet attached to all of them, just doing the work as it comes in.
Yeah, just a way to not put all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Thank you.
So you've got a job queued up to submit. Presumably we're going to hit that cool little blue button and see what happens.
We are. And one more thing before I do that, though, I just want to point out, I told you that I would talk about Conda packages. Conda is the magic that causes our managed service fleets to run. They essentially pull down Conda packages from our internal Deadline Cloud Conda channel. And each of those packages is like a application like Blender that allows it to render. And so we've specified Blender 3.6 right here and our open job description, which is that job specification format that I've mentioned and Pauline has talked about. And it pulls in those packages and therefore it knows it has the exact stuff it needs to do this render job. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to hit submit right here. And one of the things that it's going to do is it's going to check to see what files it needs to upload to the S3 bucket that will allow the AWS workers who don't have access to your computer, don't have access to your file system to render this stuff in the first place. So I'm going to hit OK. And it's both hatching because it avoids re-uploading things that it has uploaded before, and it's uploading. Once the upload is finished, the submission is complete. Deadline Cloud is ready to go. Pauline, do you have the monitor open?
I certainly do.
All right. Can we kick it to Pauline?
Yeah, let's have a look.
Okay. So we're back at the monitor here. And what I've brought up is that fleet that I talked about a little bit before. It's already been activated a little bit with a whole bunch of workers. Pretty soon, let me just go back to the queue here to show you the job that was just submitted. So this is the work that is starting, and you can see that there's some progress here. Let me select the right one. So that's starting all the way here. Now, back at the fleets view, you can see that the auto-scaling status is that it is growing here, and we can see a little bit more detail about what's happening here. And you start to see that the job is beginning to pick up. And so an administrator, like what I used to do, would be able to sort of keep an eye on things, make sure that the usage was making sense in terms of the overall operational cadence that you want to hit. So it's a game of how do you maximize the amount of useful frames off the resources and trying to use less resources and trying not to grow them. But in this particular case, we want to be able to have these resources come online with our demand. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, and so we've got a few questions in here about the cost and the pricing of the services. And is what you're suggesting maybe one of those ways that we could control some of that cost is one, maybe through queues and the number of machines that we provision in our fleet. I think when Sean, maybe that's one way. And then within that, we can try to optimize the compute resources to the best that we can so that we can keep that relatively low. Would you recommend a service? A question in the chat came up about, is this something that a hobbyist could use without breaking the bank?
Yeah. So I kind of do that today because I have my own stuff I like to run. So I really like this interface, actually. So this is our usage explorer. And for folks like me who really think in terms of like wall clock time in aggregate, this makes a lot of sense. I can also group by, jobs if I wanted to get a sense of like, what is actually happening. And we're not using any licenses here since it's Blender, so there's nothing in there. But yeah, we also get a sense of instance type. So if I wanted to try and optimize the sort of resources that are coming up and make more specific changes to my fleet, I can totally do that. The fun thing here is that because I have admin permissions to this whole account, I can actually see these in estimated dollar costs based on the pricing of spot fleets that I'm running on now. So I can get a sense of, based on the split between my queues, does it make sense? Am I expecting this type of activity? And I can also choose an absolute or a relative range for those insights as well. And I can change the intervals. You can actually get a lot of these insights directly. It's all basically just going into S3 buckets and CloudWatch trails and things like that. However, we're really working on something that's going to be a little nicer for things like that, but you can generate these reports and call them down and use APIs to hit them directly as well. So yeah, thanks for letting me show that off. I think Sean's job is probably done. Let me just
It is absolutely done, and I've gone ahead and downloaded it. And so here's that render that we kicked off.
I promise I
promise
I can draw exactly like that.
We absolutely cheated. I mean, this took 9 seconds per frame to render on the farm. Most jobs are significantly longer, but it demonstrates.
Yeah, this would probably take me 9 business years to be able to crack out. This is pretty slick.
Very cool, yeah.
But yeah,
I was just about to ask, are we going to see that render? And then I see it. So you went from Blender, you submitted a job. By the time we were done talking, this thing was fully rendered.
Yeah.
Yes. And we just downloaded we opened the terminal, hit the download command, downloaded it into a local folder on our machine, and we just opened it up using Blender's animation viewer.
Very cool. Hey, Sean, Pauline, well, thanks for the demo. I mean, that was, first of all, I'm really impressed with how you guys orchestrated that demo, being able to switch back and forth and have it be cohesive. Yeah. Kudos. Great job.
Yeah. Talk about tempting the demo gods. That was pretty awesome.
Yeah, I was a former software developer, and I've been through demos, at least on from a software perspective. And it's always a couple prayers before going into that. Like, please.
Oh, yeah. Just the entire time.
Yeah.
I am so sweaty right now. It's
I was impressed. I think it's really cool. I think the interface for Deadline Cloud is super slick. I love that you can break things down by cost and kind of see things in the background and logs and kind of investigate how you're utilizing this service if you want to. I love the access control ways that you can segment different users to do things. Overall, I think a really clean service. And I love that. I've seen this a lot with other AWS service launches, is this user on IAM identity center to make it really easy to manage users and groups, just baked right into the service. So I thought that was really cool. Overall, just super impressed. And I learned something today. Hopefully our audience did too. And a lot of activity in the chat, a lot of people asking questions. A lot of people want to know about more about this. If they wanted to learn more, where would they go?
There's a bunch of different resources for them. So there is a Getting Started series on YouTube where they can kind of get a bigger feature overview. There is the main AWS Deadline Cloud landing page, which I believe has been linked in the chat. And then if you want to search the AWS blog, we've had a couple blogs on Deadline Cloud already. There's two more things I want to mention regarding Identity Center. We support the new Identity Center instance feature, which allows you to deploy an Identity Center in a sub-account of an AWS organization. So you don't need a root account anymore. And one more thing, we use Blender right here, which is free and open source software, which is great. But many of the software products that we use in the visual effects industry are not free and open source, and they require licensing and stuff like that. Deadline Cloud has pay-as-you-go, usage-based licensing for many of those products that appears as a line item on your AWS bill at the end of the month. So if you use, 746.5 hours of Nuke, that's what's going to appear on your AWS bill.
Wow, just another way to kind of control your costs or pay as you go in a managed service, AWS kind of way.
Yep.
Very cool.
I think my engineers would be really mad if I didn't also mention that the way of describing all those workloads is all open source. We opened up the specification, and the intent is to allow anything that can be run as a headless command line instruction will work on the service. So yeah, let us know if it doesn't.
Great. Well, hey, thanks for coming on the show and showing us Deadline. Kyle, Sean, Pauline, I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys come up with and rendering some really cool stuff.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Adrian.
Great.
Thanks for having us. Thank you so much.